Hello and welcome to part 4 of From the Mind of a Mystic, Devils and Deities. Today I'm going to be actually discussing the actual deities and some devils that I've interacted with. So, buckle up tight, be aware, again, as mentioned in previous episodes, I'm schizophrenic. Also, during this episode there will be discussions of illicit drug use and substance abuse, so it's listed on Spotify as explicit content. I just wanted to clarify before we move on. I have an aeronautical history, let's put it that way, but at the moment all that's in my life is mild alcohol consumption, very little, and the medications I'm prescribed a lot of by the doctors. So I just wanted to clear that up. So if this is being listened to by someone which that content might not be appropriate, please discontinue listening. But otherwise, for anyone else that it's appropriate to listen to this, let's continue with part 4 of the Devils and Deities series. Let's begin. So, I have got to give you a little bit of history, I guess. So we've done the disclaimer, we described, I don't use any of these substances anymore, but a lot of these discussions of deity are going to lean into the different drugs that I took when I saw these different beings, but that's kind of a preface of the state of consciousness I was in, and then the kind of beings that came associated with those states of consciousness. Further, I want to elaborate that at no point am I saying these things are real. I'm talking about this with the mentality of these are archetypal forces in the way that Jung would describe them. These are potentially disparate alternate dimension, higher dimension beings that could exist, that we could be interacting with directly. It's more my initial perspective was always that these were representations of things that were real beings, and then as I grew older I started questioning that and started thinking that maybe these are spirits that manifest themselves in the form of different creatures that are represented by different archetypes and thus appear in a certain fashion depending on how they're digested by the individual. To some degree, I think both of those things nowadays, I think both of those things are true. I think that there are archetypal beings that exist in a kind of hyperdimensional state that you can actually interact with, whether they're generated by the collective unconscious and their belief system within it, or whether they're actually genuine gods, like a pantheon of different gods that exist out there, that the more you relate to them, the more you interact with them, the more you perceive them, and the more you're able to glean relationship with them. But who knows, there could be aliens from another dimension that pretend to be those beings because it's what sorry, that's quite a statement, but for example, like your projection of what God would look like, as I referenced in an earlier video, like on a dimethyltryptamine trip, seeing the sky, an elder god from the kind of what am I thinking of? The kind of H.P. Lovecraft style god appeared in the sky from the clouds telling me I don't know what God is, and that soon I must, before I can enter the halls of Valhalla or whatever, that I would have to redress, recontemplate and be open to new experiences if I'm ever to interact with these deified beings. So that's one, dimethyltryptamine, elder god in the sky. I've also had a similar experience in the ocean, but we'll come back to that. So what am I saying? However you so choose to digest these experiences, I'm going to report the experiences that I've had and the different states of consciousness, affiliated drugs, and the gods and goddesses and deities and beings and demons that I have seen in some detail, so that I can give a kind of report. Whether you think that that is the function of a broken brain, or whether you think that that's a pantheistic god system, or whether they're all aliens, or what, however you want to digest it, sort of irrelevant. The important thing is the story, and that I promise you these are sincere experiences. Every one of them they've stayed with me for years for reasons that these experiences are, however I evolve alongside the interpretations of them, these are unescapable aspects of my psyche that have been there since childhood, and so I interact with them on the presupposition that I'm connecting with something of validity or some sense of, quote, realness. But ultimately that's my experiential perspective, that it would be illogical to see it any other way after this duration of time. But you're welcome to your skepticism and to keeping an open mind, but also I respect the fact some of it's going to sound mad and self-indulgent. So the next phase of this, we're going to talk about a bit of my history, so I'll be back with that. So, my history. From a young age, I was introduced to the concept of God by virtue of the fact that I went to a Roman Catholic high school, a Roman Catholic primary school. I've got a Roman Catholic mother, I have a Church of England father. The discussion of God was not an alien concept. I was not raised in an environment where I was forced to believe anything. I was in a very open-minded, it is what it is, you make of it what you will. You form your own opinion. I think that's magnificent, by the way. Hats off to both of them. Like, that's a magnificent way to address the topic of God. Is, I'm not even going to really influence you, because I want you to discover it for yourself. And if you believe in that, that's absolutely fine, so on and so forth. But in primary school, high school, there was in-depth studies of Christianity and other religions as well, but primarily the Abrahamic religions was the main focus. Although there was some Hinduism, some Sikhism, some discussion of Buddhism as well, but it was very leaned off because it was a Roman Catholic school, I went through my first Holy Communion. I can't remember how old I was actually, but I went through all the sort of formal processes to have my first Holy Communion before I went to high school, I believe. I think I've got that timeline right. And that leads nicely into one of the first interactions I had that I perceived as to be with deity, which we'll come back to. The earlier experiences of this were through meditation with cannabis, right? Prior experiences involved hallucinations, as discussed in previous videos. But the actual interactions with phenomenologically unique states of consciousness and amazing hallucinatory content came much later, when I was college and studying. And I got into meditation through the book Introduction to Meditation, I believe it's just called, by Jim Nanda. Or it may even just be called Meditation. I'll try and remember. But when I first studied how to meditate, we did the Metta Bhavana. The Metta Bhavana, the cultivation of loving kindness, we'll come back to later, because that was a key meditation that I did at the point at which I had this massive consciousness expansion, and is really key to my story. So we'll come back to that in a bit, if I remember correctly to do so. But for example, in these days I was meditating with cannabis, very much inquiring into Buddhism. Is this useful? I'd utterly rejected Christianity at this point as a point of principle, due to the church itself, not necessarily the belief systems, obviously. I still to this day perceive myself as having some sort of fundamental relationship with whatever Christ is as an archetypal force, and again we'll come back to that. But my first most vivid hallucination was I was studying 8 hours a day on and off for like 6 months for my grade 8, and I'd been learning to tap with both hands on the bass. So then I visualized, because I had extremely strong visualization skills for music, because I was able to rehearse scales in my head, because it was so primed and imprinted on me during my waking state. I was able to visualize myself playing scales and rehearse as I was falling asleep, and quite regularly would dream that I was rehearsing and practicing scales, and continue to learn in the dreaming state. So that was a phenomenologically interesting thing anyway. But I visualized the fretboard as laid down flat in front of me like a piano, and then I added one hand to playing, and then I extended the fretboard in my mind almost instinctively and used my other hand to play. And then what happened from there was this kind of sort of automatic synthesis of everything I've been studying, and the end result was me playing a full orchestra with thousands of hands across thousands of stringed instruments, whereby I could control the entire flow of an orchestra piece that lasted several hours. And it was like I was weeping in places, I was horrified, and other beautiful hallucinations where I was guiding music itself through this hugely in-depth sort of cannabis-induced hallucinatory meditation state. And that was the first real turning point where I started to recognize I could have some influence over my hallucinatory content and interact with it. That was fascinating. So that was cannabis, but there was no deity involved there necessarily. It was just mental techniques designed to cultivate a deeper state of consciousness. God, there's so much to cover here. So I mentioned the metta bhavana, so let's explore that. This happened later, at the point, probably a year after my drug-induced psychosis from suicide attempt. I did, but a year before my eventual submersion into hell through deep psychosis. And I was on MDMA, or coming down from MDMA, and I was doing a meditation that was described in this original meditation book that I hadn't done for a very long time, called Metta Bhavana, which is the cultivation of loving kindness. In a nutshell, you kind of, the short form of it is you imagine someone very close to you, how it feels to love them, and then you migrate that and expand that sense of love until it goes deeper and further and further and further to people that are so irrelevant, until it becomes the entire universe, the entire galaxy, the entire universe, and everything in all of existence that your love is extended to. In this kind of Buddhist projection of absolute love. And then you're supposed to return all that love back to yourself at the end of the cycle. But what happened is, because I was on MDMA, I found that the perception was I telepathically contacted every single one of these beings, and were met, as the Buddha did in some stories, met this ultimate overwhelming waveform of their suffering, their incredible suffering that was completely out of line. Like, I sent all this love out, and what was returned to me was just this deep waveform of samsaric suffering from everything in existence, and that was hard to handle in itself. But then, as a consequence of this, I also offered a prayer to a kind of guardian spirit, just because I was so overwhelmed by this experience. I was trying to invoke a guardian, like a shamanic guardian, like a force. I can't remember what I used to call it, but I did that, and then this light came down into my body, and then at the end of this prayer, my eyes refocused, and all of a sudden I could see this like wraiths, a bit like in Lord of the Rings, or in like the Death Eaters in Harry Potter, like this infinite expanse of wraiths that suddenly clocked my presence and flew into me, ripping apart my light body, which I could physically feel for hours. And it was horrifying. And when I managed to finally sort of rescind from that experience, I saw a ghost that I then followed around the house, and could see this ghostly apparition moving around the house, which was terrifying in itself. Years later, cross-correlating experience on a drug called methylamine-propane, which is like a stimulant. A whale-shaped light being came in through my window with these, like, a massive array of arms, and cleared out all of these troublesome spirits that were left, that I hadn't managed to clear myself. They pulled out all this darkness from my body. These hands just came over me, cleansing me, and like refilling the content of basically my spirit. My soul was healed by that. And then from there, I went into a deep hallucinatory trance, where I went down into hell and rallied the armies of hell to destroy heaven and hell. So we went up to heaven, smashed through the gates, destroyed all of heaven, recruited everyone, went all the way back down to hell, destroyed hell. And here's another interesting side note. Since then, I've had access to this kind of horde of like beings that are presumably imaginary, hallucinatory, but that I'm like an emperor, god type, but not quite god, but like god emperor, I don't know, leader of these very loyal, fealty sworn beings that are able to act on my behalf and act as a protective guardianship. They're not evil at all. They're deeply reverential and loving and protective, and a part of my unique psychical structure. You see how convoluted and complex all these experiences are. So I have a horde of guardian spirits that can act on my behalf, and they might protect me from invasive psychic energy, from psychic attacks, from hallucinations, and so on and so forth. I can call them into being, and they serve me, and I serve God. And so that's a fascinating state. The DMT Elder God we covered. I've had multiple visions of Shiva, which is an interesting one, because obviously with my history as explained, it would be evident why God, the Godhead, would appear to me as Christ. And indeed, one of my most recent hallucinations was a vision of Christ over me. This is again a long time ago, but the most recent one on mushrooms was having Christ appear above me, pouring pearls of pure consciousness, like almost as though he was giving me. These pearls were made of soul content, and they filled me and filled me and filled me and filled me via my stomach. Just pouring from this satchel, just giving more and more and more souls to me somehow, which was an entirely bizarre experience. And it was literally the sort of the biblical Jesus, the Christian Jesus figure was just giving me these light spheres, these pearls of energy and consciousness infused into me. And then I had this like, and I'd been invocating him, I'd been praying to Christ, but I'd rarely have him appear in visions, no matter how hard I invocate, even though my interactions with Christ seem to be fruitful and energetically prosperous, because I know how to negotiate with that being, because he's a part of my consciousness. Basically, he exists in my heart and my soul and my light and my mind, and so it's an archetype that I have an enormous relationship with. I can see now, I've got a picture in the room with me. I've got the Buddha, I've got Christ, I've got Krishna, and I've got the Trimurti, because they've all appeared to me, and we're going to move on to that shortly. One of the most interesting hallucinations I had in relationship to Christ was, I still haven't really fully made sense of this, but I was extremely drunk, and I was laid in bed after a one-night stand, and the radio detuned. We were listening to like a normal FM radio, and he went, "You have broken the covenant," and lightning struck outside, and then it retuned again. Believe me, that acting in reality thing, like, I had to block that out for ages, because it was such a terrifyingly confusing thing. There's some understanding that I'd broken a covenant with God somehow, or with something. That was fascinating, and that was just drunk. What else we got? Rained down lotus petals on me in the guided meditation session on a gram of ketamine, done in 3 lines, and on the last line I went into what I would perceive to be the astral realm, and had prayed to the Buddha, and it rained down unlimited, infinite lotus petals upon me. I was raised. I was sat in a bath. Not bath, sorry, like a bathed in this cold water of this kind of infinite lake pond, where the Buddha rained down lotus petals, filled my soul. I had some sort of communication with him that's now no longer accessible to my mind. And in that moment, I had this kind of transpersonal experience of traveling through time, of having jumped from perhaps an alternate life into the current moment, where I had this massive sense of remembrance that I was in fact in some way the Buddha of some kind, but the Buddha was me, but he was guiding me as well, and I wasn't actually the Buddha, but it was like an inference that I was some sort of time traveler. That was a very recurrent theme when I used ketamine. I had 4-AOC DMT, which is synthetic psilocybin. Went into that state and had these very, very very clear, undisturbed hallucination that every time I close my eyes, a Shiva like a blue or black or dark, like a coloured skinned Shiva was floating off in the darkness, probably about 100 feet or so away, and he sort of nodded at me and gave me acknowledgement that he could perceive me, and it just sat there. Every time I closed my eyes, it was there for like 6 hours. There was just this guardian Shiva like being watching over me, which is entirely like, you know, peculiar to me. But I've had multiple experiences of interacting with a kind of playful deity that presents itself as Shiva and mushroom trips as well. So it wasn't that alien that it disturbed me, but it was like, oh shit, this thing's made out of like neon hyper ultra coloured neo digital light and seems to be emanating from like a electrostatic digital void of consciousness, and he's just watching me and making sure I know I'm safe. So that was fucking cool. On the 4AC DMT, I've had innumerable similar experiences, one of which was Shiva's face appeared at the peak of a mushroom and cannabis trip. It just induced the mushroom trip with cannabis and had this like portal open up. We'll come to portals opening up in a bit as well, because 7 to 9 gram mushroom trip, I saw a portal open up in front of me made out of yellow and green electrostatic digital liquid conscious light, and then saw like this massive, almost the antithesis of the dark visions of the Wraiths. I saw this like massive field of godlike creatures that could be like the participants in heaven, the people of heaven, trying to convey information to me and draw me through on 7 grams into a psilocybin trip on these B+. That was fucking cool. Back to my original point, what was I originally talking about? Spiraling Shiva erupting at the peak of the trip. This like sort of cartoon Shiva face appeared out of a portal and then spiraled around me in an infinite fractal pattern and lifted my soul and filled me with light. I've also had a kind of Krishna-like God experience where on mushrooms again, where this like emanation of ultimate love sent wave after. This was on McKenna mushrooms. If you ever tried them, again, very long time ago, but I'm just reporting this content. Wave after wave of like soul healing, soul being rebuilt back into my psyche. I was deeply depressed, deeply stressed, deeply anxious, deeply suffering, and it basically was like a regenerative light force of just absolute love. I was weeping from it, like every breath in, like wave after wave of just unparalleled sense of protective, loving energy was beamed into me, and it healed me and rebuilt my psyche, and I perceived that to be some sort of Krishna or Christ anointed state of consciousness was given to me and beamed into me. So yeah, that's quite a lot of information. I mentioned in previous episodes there's an Ophanim, a guardian angel that I have a continued relationship with, even without using psychedelics anymore. I'm still visited by this like orb, this light eye thing that communicates with me. Talked about the ghosts. One thing I haven't talked about is going to the seafront at the middle of the night and praying to the ocean god, whatever the god of the ocean is. So you could say Poseidon, you could say even Cthulhu, some sort of being in the ocean. And there was clouds over the sky. I felt that by virtue of dynamic interaction with this being, that it was responding to my requests and the prayer-like dynamic of this deity. I lifted my hand up in the air and swiped across the clouds, and then the wind came in at that exact moment. Bear in mind I was on mushrooms and cannabis, but this is a recurrent theme for me, this kind of weather mage-esque ability to seemingly interact with the weather, but we can cover that in a later episode. Waved my hand across the clouds, the wind blew at that exact moment, the clouds started to dissipate, they formed over the pier, I thought a storm formed, and then by that point I was like, I'm getting the fuck out of here. I just caused a storm. What the shit? and the moon appeared behind it, and it was this epic, really kind of surprisingly still ocean. There was this very real sense that Poseidon or Cthulhu or some sort of sea god had just demonstrated their power to me by virtue of my prayer and request and interaction with them. That was surreal. And yeah, how long have we been talking? So, quite some time. I'm just going to regroup my psyche, but that is basically the majority of the experiences I've had. There has been, as mentioned in a previous episode, this complete dissolution of self into Christ consciousness, which is basically all 3D forms, all material form ceased to exist, and I went into this green electrostatic digital Christ like fire. I call it the liquid digital fire of Christ consciousness. I wrote some poetry about that, as you do, but it was as though everything material was detuned and I could just see the substrate, the structure of reality in its sort of electro-digital form, and that seemed to be related to praying to Christ on deep, deep, deep levels of cannabis, and that is a recurrent theme with how I used to use cannabis, was praying to some Christ-like state and having some incredible experiences as a consequence of it. And yeah, actually, probably I'll just finish up there because I'm very cognizant of time. The last thing I will talk about is recognizing the Buddha nature and another time jump when I was on LSD, walking through some rapeseed fields and having the ultimate recognition that I was one consciousness, the full culmination of everything that had ever happened to me and ever would happen to me, that I was dissolved in my entirety, and the accompanying hallucinations were gone, save the fact that the lights were dripping and that I'd kind of gone into a slightly different phased like frame rate prior to this. But then I had this ultimate revelation as myself as not only the all of existence but none of existence, this total dissolution of self, this recognition of complete and total unity with all that was, that there was only this moment, that I was in one consciousness, and that consciousness was God, and what the God ceased to be and even needed extraction, and that I was just merely a part of this pulsating, live, vibrant, infinite universe that only existed in this one moment, but also existed for all eternity in an eternal, infinite fluctuation of the mental and spiritual and psychical constructs of reality that was God's mind, and that I was that thing. Like, then I passed out. So there's a bit of that's probably all I'm going to cover today. It's like, there are all the experiences I could conjure to record to talk about. A lot of them can be expanded on. If you've got any questions, if you're watching this on YouTube, please leave comments and tell me what you would like me to expand on, or ask any questions that you might want to, or even just put your perspective on it. I don't mind. But this is my sort of, that's probably condensed into, 30 minutes. The first 25 years of my life, 30 years of my life, of my deity relationship with all that religious content. And then to finish, I'm going to say, please like, subscribe if you're on YouTube. Please follow if you're on Spotify. Please leave me feedback, share this with anyone that might find it interesting. And this has been From the Mind of a Mystic podcast, episode 4. What deities am I talking about? So I'm trying to think of a snappy title on the fly. The actual deities. So yeah, the actual deities I've met. There we go, episode 4. Right, I will see you in part 5, where we start to move forward and digest things a little bit more succinctly, and hopefully get some clarity on the previous 4 episodes. So thank you for listening. I've been David Bradley, aka From the Mind of a Mystic. Thank you. Goodbye.